Welcome everyone, my name is Bart van Erp and it's my pleasure to be presenting here at EUSIPCO. I'm a PhD student at the IEEE under supervision of Bert de Vries, and today I will be presenting my work on hybrid inference with invertible neural networks and vector graphs. Our research group BIAS-Lab, short for the Bayesian Intelligent Autonomous Systems Lab, is located in the Eindhoven University of Technology. Our research is aimed at automating the development of novel signal processing and control systems to neuro-inspired, free energy minimizing agents. Our solutions are a natural consequence of performing probabilistic inference on generative models of our environment in applications such as audio processing or robotics. The generative probabilistic models allow us to implement domain-specific knowledge of our environment. Specifically, we work with Forney-style vector graphs in order to visualize our models, and we use a localized message passing procedure to perform probabilistic inference. As the project I will present today will closely follow up upon these methods, I will first give a short introduction about them. Suppose that we have the following vectorizable model, containing the vectors fa, fb, fc, and fd. Some of them share variables, as you may see. For example, fa and fb both share the variable x2. In a vector graph notation, the vectors in this model become nodes, and the variables become edges in our graph. As you can see, the vectors that share variables are connected by the edges corresponding to that respective variable. And in this way, we can visualize our models and easily represent the natural vectorization that is present in our model. Now that we have performed the first step, the model specification, it is time to turn to the second step, the probabilistic inference. Suppose that we wish to compute a marginal distribution over the variable x4. This requires the marginalization over all variables x except for the variable x4. If performed naively, this integration can become high-dimensional, very computational demanding, and sometimes even intractable because it just grows too big. Luckily, we can leverage the vectorizable structure in our model to decompose this large and expensive global integration by recursive computation of smaller local integrations. Using the distributive law of integration, we can push in some of these integrals and rewrite this large integration. The intermediate results that we obtain here are denoted by mu and can be regarded as summaries of particular parts in our vector graph. These summaries in turn are better known as messages, and this distributive computation is known as message passing. This approach yields a far more efficient algorithm than simply naively computing these marginal distributions in our graph. In the vector graph, you can see how these messages mu are can be regarded as the summaries of the corresponding dashed boxes. The actual computation of this marginal distribution over the variable x4 is simply the product of the colliding messages on the edge of the variable x4. So on this edge we have two messages colliding, and their product will return our marginal distribution. The integrations required to compute the marginal distributions might not be analytically solvable for various combinations of vector nodes and messages. Therefore, we may need to perform some approximate computations in order to retain tractability of our inference problem. In our message passing framework, we can compute these messages based on optimizing a constrained battery energy functional. Based on the local constraints that we enforce for the approximate posterior distributions, we can obtain different message passing algorithms, performing exact inference, as you saw on the previous slide, variational inference, expectation propagation, expectation maximization, and so on. Importantly, these local constraints allow us to specify local inference algorithms in our probabilistic models, depending on the desired properties that we wish to see from our inference algorithm. Importantly, we can also combine these algorithms. So in a single probabilistic model, we can perform both some product message passing, expectation propagation, expectation maximization, and this combination of these different inference algorithms in a single probabilistic model is what we know as hybrid message passing. A downside of this approach is that our algorithms are limited to standard vector and message pairs. Basically, if we come up with a new vector or with new messages, we need to manually derive the messages that correspond to that particular node. This can be time consuming and also quite tedious to perform. Another problem is that tractable problems often are limited to just linear models. However, most interesting problems actually have a certain degree of nonlinearity in them. As an example, we can consider the nonlinear classification problem on the right, where we wish to classify the individual points that are being separated by this clearly nonlinear decision boundary. Now the question arises, but if we are limited to these standard vector and variable pairs, can we not model arbitrary functions then? The answer is actually yes, we can model arbitrary functions. If we have a nonlinear relation, g for example, we can approximate this outgoing message on the edge y based on the incoming message on the edge x. But only this is possible in the forward direction. If we wish to compute the backward message toward x, this proves to be significantly more difficult, as it's difficult to infer the input from an output of a nonlinear function. As an example, we can consider the nonlinearity G to be a neural network. This neural network can contain fully connected layers, ReLU layers, and these ReLU layers make it very difficult to actually propagate through this network backwards. Suppose that the output of this ReLU layer is 0, then in theory our input could have been anywhere on the negative real axis. This is a huge problem that limits us from actually using these generic arbitrary functions in vector graphs for solving nonlinear problems, and limits basically our scope to a specific class of linear probabilistic models. In our paper we resolved this issue by turning to invertible neural networks based on recent advances in the normalizing flows community. Let's consider the function g to map an input x from a d-dimensional real space to an output y, also a d-dimensional real space. And we enforce this function g to be both invertible and smooth. If we have this invertible function, then suddenly we can compute this backward message through this function g again, and we can perform inference in all kinds of different models. Without loss of generality, our function g can be composed of smaller invertible mappings and still retain this invertible properties. Based on this definition, we can simultaneously write its Jacobian as the product of the intermediate Jacobians of these smaller mappings. If we know that g is invertible, we can approximate the computation of this backward message in a variety of ways. Our first approximation method would be to linearize this nonlinearity using a first-order Taylor expansion around the mean of the incoming distribution. This approach, however, requires access and knowledge about the Jacobian matrix of our nonlinearity. An alternative approach that doesn't require this Jacobian is the uncentered transform. This transform selects a deterministic set of samples, also known as sigma points, which capture the characteristics of the incoming distribution. These points then get individually processed by our nonlinearity in order to form a set of transformed sigma points. And from these transformed sigma points, we can extract our message, our distribution, by computing the sample mean and sample covariance of these transformed sigma points. Finally, we can also resort to other sampling techniques. However, these are usually more computationally expensive, and if possible, we would prefer this computation to be as efficient as possible. Importantly, by using these invertible neural networks, we can perform these approximations not only in the forward direction, as we already were able to, but also in the backwards direction. This allows us to create more complex models containing nonlinearities, in which we can not only do filtering, but also smoothing. Although we've mentioned that this function g is assumed to be invertible, that doesn't mean that we have actually access to its inverse. And because of that, it can be still very tedious to compute this message towards the input of that particular function. Luckily, this problem has been solved by the coupling layers, where we split our input and output. Here I just simply demonstrate the additive coupling layers. So what happens is that our input x gets split, and x1, which is the first partition of this input, is directly propagated to our output y1. And y2, the second output, is simply equal to x2 plus some function of x1. Based on this structure, it becomes possible to always extract our input based on our output, as x1 simply equals y1, and x2 can be written as y2 minus a function of y1, or x1 of course, because these are equal. As you can see, there are no constraints on the function f, and this function f can be arbitrarily complex. Basically, by resorting to this construction, where we split our input, we automatically achieve invertibility, with easy access to its inverse function. Between these coupling layers, of course, we also need to apply some permutations in order to make sure that this variable x1 eventually gets transformed in order to capture the entire nonlinearity of our problem. To illustrate our approach, we built a hybrid nonlinear binary classifier in order to separate the points on the right. The probabilistic model that we specify for this purpose can be drawn as follows. Suppose that we have a set of points w, which can be latent, which are transformed by this nonlinearity g, in order to form some output set. These points are then squeezed by our model into a one-dimensional space, where this probit node, which is enclosed by this dashed box, is used to properly classify these points. In this particular model, we perform a variety of message passing algorithms, also known as hybrid message passing. This probit node, for example, uses expectation propagation in order to compute its messages, and around this nonlinearity we perform an approximate method of sum product or exact message passing. For this experiment, we have implemented our methodology in our toolbox reactive-np.jl. This toolbox allows for the easy specification of probabilistic models, automatic message passing schedule generation, and efficient message passing based inference, stated as a reactive process. We learn the underlying function g based on this data through automatic differentiation with our battery energy objective as a cost function. The results of the experiments are shown in the figure. On the left we can see the original data points with the correct classification labels. In the middle we can see how these points look like if we transform them by our optimized nonlinearity g. Still, the labels are the correct ones. On the right we can see how these points look like if we squeeze them into a one-dimensional space. Our probit node approximately separates or performs this classification around 0, and as you can see, the blue and red dots are very well separated around that point. The classification map looks as follows. So on the left again we can see the actual true data, the underlying data, and in the middle we can see our predicted labels of our data points. On the right we can see a more continuous version of this classification mapping, and we can see that the nonlinearity, which was fairly simple, actually is able to classify this bottom right half of our search space as being red instead of blue. A benefit of using these invertible networks is that they also allow for a more efficient message passing procedure in a large number of probabilistic models. Because of this invertibility, they both support mean covariance and mean precision parameterizations to be propagated through this graph, and therefore it allows for less inversions in order to convert between these parameterizations. Aside from that, this research allows our research group to continue on with a large class of nonlinear probabilistic models without having to rederive all these update rules again and again for common vector and message pairs. Finally, we would like to note that a thorough comparison of the different approximation methods is required for probabilistic models containing these invertible nonlinearities. Of course, the performance can depend on the actual application, so this is something to keep in mind. And with this I would like to conclude the presentation of our work. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me either by email or just by talking to me at the conference. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all a wonderful time at EUSIPCO 2022. Thank you.